Communicating clearly with the inspector is essential. Emphasize that the newly discovered violations were not part of the work that was performed. Provide documentation of the specific tasks completed, including the permit description. Consider the client's perspective. Explain the situation to the client and discuss options for resolving the issue without putting undue financial burden on them. In cases where the client cannot afford repairs, explore potential solutions. Firstly, suggest contacting the previous electrician or the homeowner's insurance company. Secondly, offer to provide a list of licensed electricians who can assess and repair the violations. Thirdly, collaborate with the inspector to determine if there are any alternative solutions that meet code requirements but are less expensive. To prevent future occurrences, inspect the property thoroughly before starting work. This can help identify potential code violations that may not be immediately apparent and highlight them to the client. Get it in writing. Include a clause in your contract that explicitly states that your work is limited to the specific tasks agreed upon and does not include identifying or fixing existing problems unless explicitly requested and paid for by the client. Educate clients. Explain to clients that panel swaps do not typically trigger code compliance requirements. However, if they have concerns about the electrical system, encourage them to have it inspected by a licensed electrician. Regarding legal considerations, in some jurisdictions, there may be a legal obligation to report electrical hazards to the authorities. However, this typically applies to situations where unsafe practices or installations are witnessed during the work. If the inspector insists on holding you responsible for fixing the violations, it may be necessary to consult with an attorney to determine the legal options. It is important to handle these situations professionally and communicate clearly with all parties involved. By documenting your work, setting clear expectations with clients, and exploring alternative solutions, you can minimize the risk of being held responsible for existing code violations in the future. When dealing with electrical work and potential code violations, it's crucial to understand your responsibilities and how to navigate these situations effectively. The initial step involves clear and open communication with the electrical inspector. It is important to emphasize that the code violations identified, specifically the exposed non-metallic sheathed cable feeding the refrigerator receptacle and the absence of cable clamps at the junction box, were not part of the electrical work performed under the permit. Provide the inspector with detailed documentation outlining the specific tasks completed, such as swapping out the 100 amp fuse box for circuit breakers, adding a circuit and receptacle for a gas stove, replacing a loose receptacle box, and correcting polarity issues. This documentation should align with the permit description and any contracts or agreements with the client. This clear communication helps establish the scope of the work and clarifies that the existing violations were not introduced or altered as a result of the electrical work. In addition to the inspector, it's essential to consider the client's perspective. Explain this situation to the client in a clear and straightforward manner. Discuss the code violations that were identified and the potential options for resolving these issues. It's important to have an open and honest conversation about the cost associated with correcting the violations and to explore ways to minimize the financial burden on the client. This may involve prioritizing the most critical repairs or seeking alternative solutions that meet code requirements while remaining cost-effective. If the client is unable to afford the necessary repairs, several potential solutions can be explored. Firstly, suggest that the client contact the previous electrician who performed work on the electrical system or contact their homeowner's insurance company to determine if the repairs are covered under their policy. Secondly, offer to provide the client with a list of licensed electricians in the area who can assess the violations and provide competitive quotes for the repair work. This allows the client to make an informed decision based on their budget and preferences. Thirdly, collaborate with the electrical inspector to explore alternative solutions that may meet code requirements while being less expensive than the standard repair method. This may involve utilizing different wiring methods, rerouting cables, or installing additional protective devices. Preventing future occurrences of similar situations is crucial for maintaining professionalism and avoiding potential disputes. Firstly, conduct a thorough inspection of the property before starting any electrical work. This inspection should identify any potential code violations or safety hazards that may not be immediately apparent. By highlighting these issues to the client before starting the work, you can establish clear expectations and avoid being held responsible for pre-existing problems. Secondly, incorporate a clause in the contract that explicitly states that the work is limited to the specific tasks agreed upon and does not include identifying or fixing existing problems unless specifically requested and paid for by the client. This clause should be clear, concise, and easily understood by the client. It provides legal protection and helps prevent misunderstandings regarding the scope of the work. Thirdly, educate clients about the electrical system and their responsibilities as homeowners. Explain that panel swaps or other electrical upgrades do not typically trigger a requirement to bring the entire house up to current code compliance. However, if clients have concerns about the safety or functionality of their electrical system, encourage them to have it inspected by a licensed electrician. This proactive approach can help identify potential problems early on and prevent them from escalating into more significant issues. In addition to these preventative measures, it's important to understand the legal considerations related to electrical work and code violations. In some jurisdictions, there may be a legal obligation to report electrical hazards to the authorities, particularly if they pose an immediate threat to safety. However, this typically applies to situations where unsafe practices or installations are witnessed during the course of the work. It's essential to be aware of the local regulations and to consult with an attorney if there are concerns about legal obligations. If the electrical inspector insists on holding you responsible for fixing the code violations, it may be necessary to consult with an attorney to determine the legal options. An attorney can review the contract, the permit, and the relevant regulations to assess your liability and provide guidance on how to proceed. In conclusion, handling electrical code violations requires a combination of clear communication, proactive measures, and a thorough understanding of the legal and ethical obligations. By documenting the work, setting clear expectations with clients, exploring alternative solutions, and seeking legal advice when necessary, the risk of being held responsible for existing code violations can be minimized. The key is to act professionally and ethically, prioritizing safety and compliance with all applicable regulations. Electrical codes are in place for safety. When performing electrical work, understanding the relevant codes and regulations is paramount. Dealing with existing code violations that are discovered during a project can be tricky, but there are several strategies for handling such situations professionally and ethically. Open communication is key. When an inspector identifies code violations that were not part of the original scope of work, the first step is to communicate clearly and professionally with both the inspector and the client. Explain to the inspector that these violations were pre-existing and not a result of the work that was performed. Provide documentation, such as the permit details and the contract with the client, to support this claim. It's also important to have a frank discussion with the client about the code violations. Explain the nature of the violations, the potential risks they pose, and the options for correcting them. Be transparent about the costs involved and the potential consequences of not addressing the issues. When discussing code violations with clients, it's important to educate them about the importance of electrical safety and the purpose of the code requirements. Explain that the code is designed to protect people and property from electrical hazards, such as fire and shock. Emphasize that correcting the violations is not just about complying with regulations, but also about ensuring the safety of their home and family. When dealing with code violations, it's important to know the local regulations and the responsibilities of both the electrician and the homeowner. In some jurisdictions, the electrician may have a legal obligation to report unsafe conditions to the authorities, even if they were not caused by the electrician's work. It's also important to understand whether the jurisdiction has a trigger provision, which requires the entire electrical system to be brought up to code when certain types of work are performed, such as a panel upgrade. In situations where the client is unwilling or unable to pay for the necessary repairs, there are several options to consider. Firstly, offer to provide the client with a list of qualified electricians who can provide competitive bids for the work. This allows the client to shop around and find an electrician who fits their budget. Secondly, explore the possibility of phasing the repairs, addressing the most critical violations first and deferring less urgent issues to a later time. This can make the cost of repairs more manageable for the client. Thirdly, consider offering a discount or payment plan to help the client afford the necessary repairs. This can be a good way to build goodwill and ensure that the code violations are addressed in a timely manner. To prevent similar situations from arising in the future, there are several steps that can be taken. Firstly, perform a thorough inspection of the electrical system before starting any work. This can help identify potential code violations early on and allow you to discuss them with the client before the project begins. Secondly, include a clause in the contract that addresses the possibility of discovering pre-existing code violations. This clause should outline the responsibilities of both the electrician and the client in such situations, including who is responsible for paying for the repairs. Thirdly, educate clients about the importance of electrical safety and the code requirements. This can help them understand the potential risks of code violations and the importance of addressing them. Dealing with code violations can be challenging, but by communicating effectively, understanding the local regulations, and taking proactive steps to prevent future issues, electricians can navigate these situations professionally and ethically. Remember that the ultimate goal is to ensure the safety of the electrical system and protect the well-being of the client. When faced with a situation where an electrical inspector identifies code violations that were not part of the original work performed, it's essential to approach the matter with a clear understanding of your responsibilities and the applicable regulations. Firstly, it's crucial to communicate effectively with the inspector. Clearly explain that the identified violations were pre-existing conditions and not a result of the work completed under the current permit. Provide detailed documentation outlining the scope of work, including the specific tasks that were performed and any areas that were explicitly excluded. This documentation should align with the permit application and any contracts or agreements with the client. By presenting a clear and concise explanation, you can help the inspector understand the situation and avoid being held responsible for issues that were beyond your control. Secondly, engage in open and honest communication with the client. Explain the nature of the code violations, the potential risks they pose, and the options for addressing them. Be transparent about the cost associated with the necessary repairs and any potential consequences of not resolving the violations. It's important to manage the client's expectations and ensure they understand that the repairs are separate from the original project. In cases where the client is unwilling or unable to pay for the additional work, explore potential solutions to minimize the financial burden. Firstly, suggest contacting the previous electrician who performed work on the electrical system or their homeowner's insurance company to determine if the repairs are covered under their policy. Secondly, offer to provide a list of qualified electricians who can provide competitive bids for the repair work, allowing the client to choose an option that fits their budget. Thirdly, collaborate with the inspector to identify alternative solutions that meet code requirements but are less expensive or disruptive. This may involve exploring different wiring methods, rerouting cables, or installing additional protective devices. To prevent similar situations from arising in the future, implement proactive measures to identify and address potential code violations before starting any work. Firstly, conduct a thorough inspection of the electrical system before beginning the project. This inspection should identify any pre-existing code violations or safety hazards that may not be immediately apparent. Secondly, include a clause in the contract that explicitly states that the work is limited to the specific tasks agreed upon and does not include identifying or fixing existing problems unless specifically requested and paid for by the client. This clause should be clear, concise, and easily understood by the client. Thirdly, educate clients about the importance of electrical safety and the potential risks associated with code violations. Encourage them to have their electrical systems inspected regularly by a qualified electrician and to address any identified issues promptly. In addition to these preventative measures, it's important to be aware of the legal and ethical considerations related to electrical work and code violations. In some jurisdictions, electricians may have a legal obligation to report unsafe conditions to the authorities, even if they were not caused by their work. It's also important to understand the potential liability associated with performing electrical work that does not comply with applicable codes and regulations. If you encounter a situation where you are unsure of your legal or ethical obligations, consult with an attorney or a qualified professional in the electrical industry. By following these guidelines, you can navigate challenging situations involving code violations with professionalism, integrity, and a commitment to electrical safety. The ultimate goal is to protect the well-being of the client and ensure that their electrical system is safe and compliant with all applicable regulations. When facing situations involving electrical code violations discovered after completing a project, it's crucial to handle them with professionalism, transparency, and a clear understanding of your responsibilities. Firstly, engage in open communication with the electrical inspector. Clearly articulate that the identified violations were pre-existing conditions and not a consequence of the work performed under the current permit. Provide detailed documentation outlining the scope of work, including the specific tasks completed and any areas explicitly excluded from the project. Ensure this documentation aligns with the permit application and any contracts or agreements established with the client. By presenting a well-documented explanation, you can facilitate a clearer understanding of the situation for the inspector, minimizing the likelihood of being held accountable for issues beyond your direct control. Secondly, maintain transparent communication with the client. Explain the nature of the discovered code violations, highlighting the potential risks they pose and the available options for remediation. Provide a clear breakdown of the costs associated with the necessary repairs and any potential ramifications of not addressing the violations promptly. Managing the client's expectations is paramount, ensuring they comprehend that the required repairs fall outside the scope of the original project agreement. In situations where the client expresses reluctance or inability to cover the costs of the additional work, explore alternative solutions to alleviate the financial burden. Firstly, suggest they reach out to the previous electrician who conducted work on the electrical system or contact their homeowner's insurance provider to ascertain whether the repairs are covered under their existing policy. Secondly, offer to provide a list of qualified electricians in the area who can furnish competitive bids for the repair work, empowering the client to select an option that aligns with their budgetary constraints. Thirdly, collaborate with the inspector to identify alternative solutions that satisfy code requirements while minimizing expenses and disruptions. This may involve exploring alternative wiring techniques, rerouting cables, or integrating additional protective devices to enhance safety and compliance. To mitigate the recurrence of similar situations, implement proactive measures to identify and address potential code violations before commencing any electrical work. Firstly, conduct a comprehensive inspection of the electrical system before initiating the project. This inspection should aim to uncover any pre-existing code violations or safety hazards that may not be immediately obvious. Secondly, incorporate a clause into your contract that explicitly defines the scope of work, stipulating that it is limited to the agreed-upon tasks and does not include identifying or rectifying existing problems unless specifically requested and compensated for by the client. This clause should be unambiguous, concise, and readily comprehensible to the client. Thirdly, educate clients about the importance of electrical safety and the potential risks associated with code violations. Encourage them to schedule regular inspections of their electrical systems by qualified electricians and to promptly address any identified issues to maintain a safe and compliant environment. In addition to these preventative measures, it's essential to remain informed about the legal and ethical considerations surrounding electrical work and code violations. In certain jurisdictions, electricians may be legally obligated to report unsafe conditions to the relevant authorities, regardless of whether they were directly responsible for creating them. Understanding the potential liability associated with performing electrical work that doesn't adhere to applicable codes and regulations is also crucial. If you encounter uncertainty regarding your legal or ethical responsibilities, seek guidance from an attorney or a qualified professional within the electrical industry. By adhering to these guidelines, you can effectively navigate complex situations involving code violations with professionalism, integrity, and a steadfast commitment to electrical safety. The overarching goal is to prioritize the well-being of your clients and ensure that their electrical systems are safe, reliable, and compliant with all relevant regulations and standards.